you can't really say enough about what he's done for us in terms of thinking about ecology, about our lost agrarian culture, about the importance of people who really love their land.
Some of you may remember that early in Season 1, I invited as my guest a dear friend and colleague, Dan Imhoff. Dan hails from Pennsylvania, has lived in several places around the nation, as well as Europe and China. His writing career got serious when he spent several years working as a copywriter for Esprit, the hugely successful clothing company founded by Doug and Susie Tompkins, who later became his in-laws when he married their eldest daughter, Quincy. Today, Dan is a small farmer, a musician with at least 6 albums under his belt and over 10 years of vintages as a winemaker. And he is one of the nation's best explicators and critics of the Farm Bill, the massive piece of legislation that has shaped and maintained our industrial food system with its many flaws. That was the topic of our conversation in Season 1. What people may not know is that in addition to his most well-known work as a writer about agriculture and farm and food policy, Dan has had a career in radio, and that is what we're going to speak about today. Once per month, over the next 6 months, Flipping the Table will be posting amazing radio interviews that Dan did with the pioneering farmers, writers, and practitioners that created the thinking and philosophies that are reshaping agriculture today to make it regenerative and a solution to many of our problems. We are calling this special series the Imhoff Archives. We do this to shed light on where progress has been made and where it has not, and what is new, emergent, and in focus compared to the past. Most of all, we think you will find the conversations between these pioneers fascinating because they are amazing people, one and all. Today, we give you a taste of what's to come. So with that, let's dive into my conversation with Dan Imhoff. Well, here we are in Philo, California, and we're with Dan Imhoff, and we're here to talk about the release of 6 programs called the Imhoff Archives from his radio days when he was doing a radio program. And we're on his property outside, so if you hear sounds, those will be the birds or the dog or some other sound, or maybe a truck go by, but we're outside on the property in front of the pond. So with that, Dan, welcome. It's great to have you or be with you here on your property.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks a lot for releasing some of these old conversations that we're calling the Imhoff Archives.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I think people are going to really like it. So, yeah, why don't we start with that? How did you get into the radio business talking to all these incredible pioneers?
Well, I was a freelance writer by that time, by around 1998. My wife and I had purchased a small homestead 40-acre property up in Mendocino County in the mid-'90s, and we built a house, and we were just starting to get our homestead life together, learning to grow apples. There was an existing apple orchard here from the 1880s that purportedly included a tree that Luther Burbank was trying to breed, the Stark's Red Delicious. It was, when we bought the property, it was all wired up and fenced off, and you could tell it was some kind of a special tree. At any rate, I met a local apple farmer, Tim Bates, and he has a really legendary business up here called the Apple Farm. And Tim had a show, and we'd become friends. We would talk apples. He really taught me a lot about horticulture. And this was a very important part of my genesis as a writer and a researcher, just learning how to farm. And so I was really kind of understanding what I was writing about. Anyway, Tim was a host on a monthly show on the Farm and Garden series that was out of the local radio station KZYX and Z on Mendocino County Public Broadcasting.
90.7, is that what it is?
90.7 and 91.5. And I mean, the beauty of this particular station, it was a small station, but it covered the whole county. And actually, ours was the Farm and Garden Beat, and it was a really popular show. It was Mondays at 1 o'clock, and we had a lot of listeners. And the format was kind of, interview someone for 35 or 40 minutes and then open up the phone line, so people really got to talk to these amazing people that we were bringing on the show. Yeah, so Tim asked me to become the co-host, and as I was a journalist, and I was researching topics, I could, there were people that I wanted to hear from, and because we had this show, we had this great outlet for it. And it was way back in the early days when they still had directory assistants, and you could read the flap on a book, and you could see that so and so lived in such and such town, and just find out what the area code was and call up directory assistants, and the next thing you're talking with Michael Pollan, or you're talking with Gary Nabhan or something like that, and it was magical, and we talked with a very impressive number of people.
How many
as
years
I think
did the
of
show
looking
go?
back, it went at least 10, but I think maybe 12 years. I did
Wow.
it for you.
So 90s into the late
Till about 2010.
Wow. Okay.
And once we got once I got an interview with Wendell Berry, it took me about that long. I considered my work done. Like, I'd really talked to most of the people that I wanted to talk to, but even more importantly, we moved our family back down to Sonoma County in 2001, and so even though we kept this property up here, it was harder and harder, to just get up here and continue the show. But I did it until around 2010, and then life took me in other directions.
Wow. So I know Farm and Garden sounds like it was the series, which was a weekly series, but you did once a month. So it was about other things besides just what you wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, there was a great show from two ladies that did like vegetable farming. So it was really about gardening and vegetable farming. And then there was one on landscaping. And I'm sorry, I can't remember what the fourth one was. But we were really, once I came on board, Tim was very continues to be involved in certification, organic certification, biodynamic certification. They have a program here in Mendocino County called Mendocino Renegade. And so, he was coming from a practicing commercial farmer and with a particular passion for certification, where I was a journalist and I was writing books about conservation in agriculture, about agricultural policy. And so I think we were a pretty good blend. I was pretty intellectual, and he was pretty hands-on on the ground.
Cool. So let's talk about. I mean, we are going to do the Imhoff Archives. To start, is going to include 6 programs. So let's kind of run through those 6 programs. I think we're going to start with what was your last, which was Wendell Berry, just to give people a taste of the idea, because he's really the font of so much thinking around food and agriculture and sustainability and economics, and he's really the philosopher king behind it all in a way for many of us. So we're going to start with that program, and then we're going to move into a lot of other people that were probably influenced by Wendell. But let's talk about that show, how you got it, and then let's talk about the other folks. So let's start with Wendell.
Well, Wendell Berry is really, our agrarian poet laureate, and you can't really say enough about what he's done for us in terms of thinking about ecology, about our lost agrarian culture, about the importance of people who really love their land enough to just do what they need to do in order to keep it whole. And he was a student of Wallace Stegner in the 50s. He was at Stanford University with
the great writer Wallace Stegner,
with Ken Kesey and Larry McMurtry. Just an unbelievable
Cohort.
class
Yeah.
at the Stanford Writing School that Wallace Stegner was the head of. And, he's written dozens and dozens of books of poetry and essays and nonfiction and fiction. And I was a huge fan. My wife and I had the opportunity to stay with Wendell and his wife in Kentucky on their homestead way back in the early 1990s. I would continue to bump into him at conferences and over the years, and I would always ask him if he would appear on our show, and he would always decline. I remember once I was at a meeting with him, and I'd been asked by the Sierra Club to come to Kentucky, to Louisville, to speak at this conference. And I was thinking, and here I was with Wendell and others at this meeting, and he was next to me, and I said, well, I've been asked to come to speak at this conference, and I have no idea why they would want me when they have you. And he says, well, Dan, we North Carolinians, we're a humble people. And sometimes we need someone from the outside just to come in and to justify our good intentions. So if you want to do something like that, then I think you should come on down. So I did. And of course, I got upstaged by Wendell at that conference, probably at the end, but I did my best to deliver his message that they didn't really need somebody like me to come in and tell them what they needed to do to improve their agriculture and their food policy, but they should do it. And so I don't remember exactly when, but Wendell was coming to San Francisco to receive an award. I think it was sometime around 2010. And I finally got the chance, and he agreed. He agreed to meet me at the hotel and to do the show. And Tim didn't come on this particular mission. But I really wanted to make sure I got the audio right, because when you're in, when we were in KZYX, it was always this like incredible adrenaline rush before the top of the hour and everything going on to make sure that our guest on the phone wasn't, we had the right line and we were recording it, and like there were a lot of things to think about. So I enlisted Davia Nelson of the Kitchen Sisters to be the producer and the engineer, and she happily did it.
Great.
So we had a conversation in one of the hotels up on Nob Hill, and it was really a beautiful moment in this broadcasting exercise that I had been doing.
Mm-hmm. And so it was. It's about a 45-minute program.
No, I think it's an hour.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So people will get to hear that.
And there were no questions, so it was the full hour.
Good. That's great. And then, so another person that you interviewed. Let's go with Elliot Coleman.
Yeah.
Elliot Coleman. Talk about Elliot Coleman. People may know Elliot Coleman.
Well, in the early 2000s, I started a book called Farming with the Wild. And the idea of this book was to, I was able to be in some, like a fly on the wall of some pretty remarkable conversations during the 1990s. And I really found that the conservation biologists who were calling for connections between big, wild, but isolated wilderness areas needed to be connected through North America. And those connections were inevitably through ranch lands and agricultural lands. But they were, conservationists, ecologists were often at odds with agriculture, even sustainable agriculture. And so I set off really, on this 3-year journey around the country of just trying to find not only farms, but regions where farmers and conservationists were coming together to really create fluidity and the to protect ecological cycles and ecological process on a landscape or a watershed scale.
So these are kind of life-sustaining corridors, right? Corridors of
Yeah,
life where animals move and plants, and
or where flooding is natural, or where lightning ignited wildfire is natural and necessary for grasses to regenerate, and or areas where they're able to secure conservations across at a big watershed scale that protected a variety of different species, things like that. That included farmers. And then there were also a class of kind of like wild garden farmers, of which Eliot was on the top of my list. I had been at a wedding and up in Maine, and I took the opportunity to go and visit him. He's, I think, at the 46th latitude, and he's above Acadia Park on the coast of Maine.
that's way up there.
And he'd become quite famous because he was a 4-season grower in Maine, so he grew crops during the winter. And I got to the farm at about 6:00. It was a Sunday evening, and there was a note on the table. It said, "Hi, Dan, just follow the lights." And we're down at the pond. So I walked down to the pond, and everybody was in the sauna. And, I knocked on the door and, "Hey, Dan, just take off your clothes and come on in." And so that's the way I, met Eliot Coleman.
Naked.
Yeah,
The
or at
naked
least
truth.
that's the way I presented myself there on his farm.
That's
and
great.
that was a first for me, really. And so anyway, it was a remarkable visit. He's a huge mind, a huge horticultural mind, and he became a friend over time. And
He's written books. I mean,
he's written many books.
Yeah,
The 4-season grower,
Right,
and
right.
and he had a show on PBS, and he was married to Barbara Damrosch, who also has written books, The Gardening Primer, and so they're powerhouse communications, but also practitioners of organic agriculture. And what Eliot had learned how to do was to have greenhouses that moved. So he could grow things during the summer. He could grow cover crops. He could and he could prepare these beds that he would plant in early August, and he would plant really cool season things like root crops, parsnips and carrots, and really hardy greens, a lot of Asian greens and salad greens. And then around October, when the light turned, he had these greenhouses on sleds that he could just slide right over top of this plot that he'd been preparing. And then with a real simple addition of rime, which is like a gauzy fabric that they would put over the beds.
Often white.
They created growing conditions that were similar to like Georgia or something like that. So, I mean, the real thing that you worry about, because here in California I grow all year round, but you really worry about wind. Wind can really just completely dry out a plant. They can take being icy. And because if it's sunny, and they're gonna heat up and thaw during the quickly in the morning, but you really have to worry about wind that can just burn plants to death. So he was expert at it, and I mean he was a guy who he wanted to become a good greenhouse grower, and so he traveled the entire planet at the 46th latitude, that talking to as many growers as he could that were greenhouse growers, because they exist everywhere, and so he was always learning. And I was so impressed by him. And my father-in-law lived in Chile, and he had a lot of greenhouse production on these little farming operations that he was starting, and he had Eliot come down there. I remember showing him a picture of these kind of, I want to call them peasant greenhouses, but they were just super rustic greenhouses down in Patagonia that people used, and they would just use kind of rough sawn wood and plastic sheeting. But there was one thing where they'd created this vent, this window that was really easily operable. And he looked at that picture and he said, "Wow, that is a great idea. I got to learn from that idea." And so that's the kind of person he is. He was a lifelong learner, and really, I mean, when you look back on the history of organic agriculture, you look at people like him, because
that's right.
he was one of the million people that went back to the land during the 60s, that we kind of forget about.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing that show. Let's talk now about Temple Grandin. Because we do on this show on Flipping the Table, we do a lot around grass-fed beef operations and the kind of livestock operations that are appropriate in the century that we're moving into in the period of climate chaos and climate crisis, and but it's not just about the way you ranch. It's also about how or you're treating the land. It's about how you treat the animals, and Temple Grandin is probably the expert in the world on that. So let's talk about Temple.
Well, by around 2008, I was asked to complete a book project for the Foundation for Deep Ecology. It was about industrial animal agriculture. It's
called The Tragedy of.
Eventually it was called CAFO, which is short for Confinement Animal Feeding Operation, and the Tragedy of Industrial Animal Agriculture. And so I think for that book, I was working with a research team. We found maybe 5,000 photographs, and I read probably 40 or 50 books.
I remember you were very depressed.
in order to really, really get the best essays that we could, because it was kind of photo essays, and then it was stitched together with essays from about 44 different people on various aspects of this topic.
So you were an editor.
Yeah,
that's
I
Fanny
was writer.
In the background
editor.
there, folks. That's Fanny coming up for a little hug.
She's incredibly dirty.
Yes.
She's been in the pond. So at any rate, I had read this book. It just came out, called Animals Make Us Human. As a broadcaster, you have great access to books that are just coming out, and so I immediately got it. And she's a teacher at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, but also, working a lot with different companies to improve the conditions of animals that are raised in confinement. And I really, really got a lot out of her book, because I think, it was really kind of a template for how do animals react? Why do they react? What happens when they're in confinement? What makes them, get the flight or fight response, and these kinds of things? And I thought it was really well laid out. And it's been a while since that conversation, so I'm a little bit distant from all the exact concepts. But I did always, as a broadcaster, if I had heard Terry Gross once say about her Fresh Air interviews that she took them very seriously. And so she was always prepared. She felt that was how you respected the person who was listening, but more importantly, how you respected the person who you were going to put on the air and take their time and try to get their message out there. So I would always prepare, and typically I would have about 4 pages of questions, I would say on average. So I read Temple's book really, with great interest, because I was working on this book. And if you know about her, she is infamous for being autistic. And there's a couple great movies about her autism and how she's overcome that and how she deals with it. And what you find, though, what I quickly found with Temple was that I had to be so careful in how I asked a question, because if I asked a question that could be answered yes or no, she would answer yes or no. Like typically I would ask a question. Let's just say the opposite of Temple was Robert Kennedy Jr. And I asked perhaps in an hour 6 questions to him, because you asked a question, didn't matter what it was. James Howard Kunstler did kind of the same thing. You just wind them up and they're gone, and you're just like waiting for that moment when they're taking a breath that you can ask another question. Temple was just the opposite. And in a very short amount of time, I was already through 2 pages, and I was starting to kind of freak out, because it was an hour show, and where, why, how was I going to keep this up? And I think perhaps maybe she trusted me a little bit more as time went on, or I lucked out and I had just enough questions that she could really extrapolate things on, better than just simple yes, no answers. So, but I remember the book as, just for me, it was kind of a watershed book. It really gave me a lot of insight into the animal kingdom, into what she learned as someone who has worked really hard to reform the slaughterhouse process, to reform the confinement situation. And so,
interesting.
I thought it was a great
I
conversation.
I saw one of the plants that she did. Anya Fernald from Belcampo Meat Company had used her designs, and it's very interesting that it's about angles a lot of times. It's about the right kinds of angles that the animals have to move.
They want to keep seeking.
Yeah.
Right. So they don't want to feel like they're just
going down a slot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting. So that I'm looking forward to that. So let's talk about Gary Nabhan. Brilliant guy.
Brilliant.
Love Gary. So let's talk about him. What was that about?
Gary, I met on the road for Farming with the Wild in Arizona, sometime around 2000. Gary had already won a MacArthur Genius Award for his work to preserve native plants of the Southwest. And he was teaching, I think, at the University of Arizona. And, he is an extremely intelligent, creative man. He's funny. Mm-hmm. He's energetic. And we were right down on the border of Arizona and Mexico. And, we spent some good amount of time on a lot of what I would call now, like, pretty humble experiments. I mean, like, they were really just trying their best to do things in a really extreme climate. Mm-hmm. It's also a place where there's a huge variety of birds that it's like a migratory bird funnel down there. So there's there's jaguars, and there's all kinds of life right down there on the border, and all kinds of other issues. And so I got to know him there. He became a board member of the Wild Farm Alliance for a little while,
which grew out of the book.
It actually preceded the book,
but
the book really helped launch that, give some real loft to that organization's history. And so so we got to interact for a while personally, and every time he wrote a book, which is pretty much like every year or two, I would get him on the show.
Yeah, he's like Wendell. He's written so many books.
So many good books.
Yeah,
really.
and they're fascinating. Like the one he did on tequilas agave, and the one on peppers. He's amazing.
Some Like It Hot. Yeah. So and I did all those books. There was one on a Russian plant breeder who I don't remember his name right now, but anyway, I believe the show that we're going to have on of the Gary shows is Some Like It Hot. Mm-hmm. It's about chilies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So
but it's not just about chilies. It's about human physiology and all kinds of different things.
Yeah, that's the thing about the way his mind works. I mean, he is a genius. He connects. The connectivity of it all is evident in what he writes. Cultural, physical, mineral. It's all there. Right?
Yeah. And he was always generous. Always. We would find time, and just a favorite among the listeners, mm-hmm. really.
Yeah, because he is funny, like you said. Well, let's talk about Michael Pollan. Yeah, curious about. I can't remember actually how that all began with him. Your interviews and
Michael
discussions.
Pollan, I as a writer, I used to have this folder in my desk, and it was called Articles I Wish I Had Written. And there was an article that Michael Pollan wrote in the mid-'90s called Opium for the Masses, and it was for Harper's Magazine. It was quite a stunning piece about, and part of Michael's genius in being able to really become the number one spokesperson for this movement that you're reporting on now, at least during the early 2000s, for the last decade or so. He started by just saying, I'm just a stupid gardener, and I just want to check this out, right? And so that gave him a bit of objectivity, or at least gave him
Beginner's
a
mind.
calling card of objectivity that he was going to give a fair shake to whoever he was interviewing. And, I think that's gone out the window as time has gone on. And, but anyway, he started this article by saying, that the FDA was going to, they were going to make illegal the growing of opium poppies, which was kind of a standard grandmother backyard plant. And he was thinking, as a gardener, I want to know what this is about. But really, it was about a guy who had a newsletter, and it was a newsletter that talked about how people could make psychedelic drugs at home. And this guy, he said, well, you just go down to the, your neighborhood flower store, and you get these dried poppies, and you bring them home, and you cut out the pods, and you put them in some water, and you make a tea. And that's Fanny,
That's
the
Fanny
Australian
again.
Shepherd.
Yeah, knocking into things.
She's my shadow.
Yeah, sit, Fanny. Sit quiet.
So at any rate, boy, the FDA or the feds just came down on him, the DEA, and they really ruined his life.
Wow.
And Michael wrote this incredible piece of journalism, and I always admired it. I think the first book that came out that really was The Botany of Desire. The Botany of Desire that came out, of his books. I think he had Second Nature before that. Anyway, Botany of Desire came out. We got a copy. I looked at the flap. It said he lived in Connecticut. I found the town. I called him up, and the next day he was on the show.
Wow.
And of course, The Botany of Desire really got him started. And then
on this topic, yeah, and that's a great book.
Yeah, and so again, he was just like, I'm just a gardener. I just want to figure out what's up with these genetically modified potatoes, But there was a big section on apples in that book too that really spoke to Tim and I as well. So
was that the show? Did you talk about apples on the show, or did you talk about everything?
Oh, we talked about the book. We talked about the book, and probably talked about
pot. You had to talk about marijuana.
Yeah. Yeah, and yes. So I met again. Our paths crossed again at UC Berkeley, where he became a professor. I remember very distinctly a conference that Orville Schell put on, and it was like a couple days straight of everything that's wrong with the food system, and I could see like the wheels turning in his mind. And him, I was working on a book called Paper or Plastic at the time. And he said, well, what do you think of all this? And I thought, I could see him really working out the beginnings, I believe, of Omnivore's Dilemma. I'm not sure, but I think. And then I wrote a book called Food Fight. And Michael agreed to do the foreword. And he did the foreword for a couple of those of the editions. There were revised editions of that book, and that was about the Farm Bill and food policy.
And it's actually a primer now in a lot of colleges around the country. Young people are reading that book to understand food policy. It's really important, and the Farm Bill.
And we made many appearances together at UC Berkeley, at the CDC, with Andrew Weil down at the University of Arizona, or somewhere in San Diego. I can't remember them all, but anyway. I considered him a close colleague in the early years that I was trying to bring a lot of importance to the Farm Bill's $100 billion budget as crucial in fighting the problems that we face in our food system, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you did more than one show with him, right?
Yeah, I think we did at least 2 shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So that'll be an interesting one as well. And let's see. I guess the last one we should talk about really is the one on slow food, because that was how we really started to connect and do stuff together, was because of that event. It was back in 2004 when the first Terra Madre occurred. I can't remember this. Maybe you either called me or I called you, but or I ran into you somewhere and we started talking about it, and you said, I'd like to go to that or something. I can't remember. Do you remember how that happened? I don't.
No.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. But anyway, you ended up coming.
Not only I came with my wife.
Right.
It was in 2004, I believe,
it
right?
was October 2004.
Yeah, and it was in Torino, Italy.
Right. In an amazing building.
Yeah, I've spent
biological looking.
Spent some time in Italy. I'd lived there for a year in the 80s and as a student in Rome in the 70s. At any rate, Tim Bates came as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there, and it was this gathering of 5,000 people. It included people from all over the world.
Yeah, small farmers from all over the world.
Producers of incredibly exotic oils and nuts, and nomad farmers and Western farmers, and the city of the county or something of Torino of Lombardia came out with this anti-GMO resolution, and Prince Charles was there, and he made this great keynote talk, and I presented.
Alan Savory was there
on Farming with the Wild. I gave a bunch of books out, and so anyway, our idea was of this show, and I think we still have to bump it from CD over to digital, but at any rate, we went around and just, got people in the big hall. There was this big hall, where the meeting rooms took place. And at some points there was like these pop-up bazaars and these pop-up events where people would be giving pieces of goat jerky and all these things that they'd brought from all over the world, or these really colorful African ladies dancing, and it was really
Maasai warriors were there. It was incredible.
Quite cool, right?
Yeah.
So we just went around, and whenever we could, and find people that spoke English, and asked them the same question, like what's really the biggest issue for you at this particular time, and why you're here, and what do you want to tell people about it, something like that, So really, it's just strung together list of things that people were working on. I haven't listened to it for a very long time. It's 14 years. It's 16 years ago. It would be very interesting to hear what those issues are.
I bet they're similar
now. Yeah, I think that they're probably compounded,
right,
a lot.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was cool because there were people from the folks that work with reindeer in the far north, and I remember they chartered jets, slow food chartered jets, to go around the world and pick up people who had never left their villages, and they had to get them visas. It was, oh my God, it was unbelievable. 5,000 people. I think we brought 400 or 500 farmers from the United States, farmers and ranchers from the United States, big delegations, and I remember the Russian one was really hard to do. They had to fly to Central Asia with this charter jet to pick people up and bring them in. But it created an environment that it was one of the high points of my life, that 4 days, whatever it was, because of the beauty of the entire world's producers. And the whole idea was for them to find allies, to feel not so isolated in the world and their struggles to survive. That was the key idea.
Have people followed up? I mean, has it
it's
created lasting communities and things like that?
Yeah, it still exists. That every 2 years they do Terra Madre. It's about to happen again online this year for the first time online, obviously because of COVID. But it still continues, and actually slow food's most dynamic in the developing world now. Africa, China, and the South America is really where it's dynamic. Here in the United States, it still exists, but it's not, because there's so many other things going on. Because of folks like you and others who have written books and created organizations, it's less dynamic here because there's a lot more competition for resources and people's volunteer time and so.
Well, I think that slow food has a unfair elitist
Yeah, moniker.
reputation here, and truthfully, it's not. I mean, I don't think it's fair, given that now you have pretty mainstream companies talking about farm to table. I mean, you see it out there in the world and in advertising and so in public discourse. So I think slow food has really done its job, and probably in other areas where, I mean, people are fighting for survival everywhere as small producers, but there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. And I like the show too, because it is where we connected and started to, communicate and build the friendship that's emerged and the colleagueship. I mean, and all the things that you talked about, the people that you interviewed in those years became integral to one of the things that we did that I'm most happy and excited by, which was when we did the Declaration for Healthy Food and Agriculture for the 2008 Slow Food event in San Francisco, called Slow Food Nation.
Yeah.
Wendell worked on that with us. Michael,
Yeah.
Gary,
Yeah.
a lot of people that I'm sure.
Fred Kirschman.
Fred Kirschman. Did you ever interview Alice Waters? Because she was part of that team that we pulled together to write that.
I've known Alice as a family friend for 30 years. I don't know that I ever interviewed Alice on the show. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have to say that for me personally, you roped me into that job. And we came up here to this particular homestead.
Right.
At one point for a meeting early on, and it was I mean, I have had the experience of writing a declaration. We wrote one in Vancouver in the late 90s as part of the International Forum on Globalization and the International Forum on Food and Agriculture, and Wendell Berry was actually a editor on that particular exercise, and he can be really stern. He can be very stern, and he's really anti-jargon. And when you listen to Wendell talk, but you watch him write, and he has things that really bother him, and jargon is one. The environment, for example, is something that he highly disagrees with.
The phrase.
Yes, and so he's very careful about the words that he chooses, and he would write things like an ugly turn of phrase, and I mean, even that came out in our healthy food declaration.
Right.
And I remember that early on in one of the drafts, Michael Pollan was really upset in an early draft because we hadn't really used health as the defining focus of our critique of agriculture, and that it was becoming clearer and clearer. It certainly was, as I was writing Food Fight, that the more you focused on health rather than things like, social issues or environmental issues, and you could still talk about those issues, but you would talk about them in terms of health or unhealth. Those are things that nobody wants to be unhealthy. Everybody wants to be healthy, and they want their kids to be healthy, and they want the planet to be healthy. And so, that became a very defining editorial focus of these comments, but then it's hard. It's hard when you're doing anything by committee. And I think, did we not do 40 interviews with people or something like that?
A lot of interviews. Yeah.
A lot.
I don't remember exactly.
And then I remember, it came on my shoulders to kind of whittle things down. And that's when you would come up on a, evening, and we would cook something and, drink a bottle of wine and
And argue over language.
Yes, and argue over language until we got it
Right.
to where it was. And I said, I was actually thinking it was kind of a fool's errand until, there was everybody, many of the contributors on the steps of the San Francisco City Hall and 60 Minutes filming it, and the thing was read, and you thought, okay, maybe people will pay attention.
And I have to say, that day and that event hit the front page of the New York Times, and that was the beginning, really, of the mainstream media deeply covering the food movement that weekend.
Yeah.
And it was a really important moment. And it happened because all those people did work together to get it done. I mean, it had heft. And, it's forgotten now. I mean, you can find it on the Roots of Change website, but it's forgotten now. But I think when you said that about health, that reminds me, where is Roots of Change now? We're at the Public Health Institute.
Yeah.
It migrated us.
Yeah.
And our focus.
Yeah, and it still should be there. Like, really, truly, if you think about, how much money, it's ridiculous what we're squandering our agricultural and health budgets from the Department of Agriculture on now. But I think you could also argue that there's not enough money. But you could also argue that agriculture is not just an issue of farming and of hunger, but it's an issue of self-defense. And so the Defense Department could put some money in there because they want healthy soldiers to be able to fight their wars, and they're struggling with that. The Department of Education, our education budget should be really focused around eating well. And if you have better fed kids rather than feeding them just the junk that they are right now, the byproducts of industrial ag, then you would have better students, and you would have a better literate, better educated populace. And so there's a lot of pools of which we could use to create a healthy agricultural system, and it shouldn't just be on the burden of the USDA because it's completely been undermined by agribusiness, and until we get a president who puts in an organic farmer as the head of the USDA, we'll have a really, really hard time making changes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, the other thing that you didn't mention there, but the climate. I mean, it's all about the climate now too. I mean, right? The role of agriculture in combating climate change is humongous. And
yeah, we should go from having a corn belt to a carbon belt.
Right.
I mean, across the disaster zone of what used to be the Dust Bowl states. It's ridiculous, really. I mean, all we do is pay out crop insurance to farmers that should just have roots in the soil permanently.
Right. So there's a lot to be talked about, and we will. Actually, one of the things I want to do in the future is I want to talk about Wild Farm Alliance. I want to talk about the organization and the big initiatives that we're kicking off in that organization that I think are really important models and they North Stars for the future of agriculture, growing out of the things that we're talking about today. But anyway, thank you very much for taking us through these 6 episodes that we're going to be listening to.
Great. I hope people
Imhoff
enjoy
Archives.
them. I mean, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
But it was a great ride. Yeah. And I'm happy to have had the experience to do it, and that you're putting them out there again.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. I want to get in touch with all 6 of those people and just say, look or at least 5 of the people, and then say, you got to listen to this and see what you think about. Some of these are 15 years ago.
Oh yeah, no, these are moments in time. Yeah.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.